I am your host, James Morgan, and this is History of Cities. Episode 21 Win, Victory, or Conquer. We last left off with a discussion of two events in the beginning of Justinian's reign that exemplify the different responsibilities that fall on an absolute ruler's shoulder. There are the exciting, high stakes wars that often get the ruler's name carved into the popular imagination as a glorious hero. There are also the boring and mundane, but still necessary tasks of bureaucracy and domestic policy that are not as flashy or remembered as the Great Wars, but are nonetheless just as, if not more, important. In our last episode, the war was in the east against the Sassanids. It was not glorious and did very little to change the course of history, and had almost no impact on Constantinople directly. We still include it in our narrative, because it did introduce one of the important characters that will play a pivotal role in our city's history, and it also helped explain how Justinian's plan for Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire were developing. Since before Constantine the Great moved the Roman Empire's capital to Byzantium, the East had been the cultural and economic heart of the empire. Out of the necessity of protecting this heart, the Western Empire's safety had been neglected in favor of fighting the Sassanids and other threats to the eastern provinces. The logical and pragmatic approach would be for Justinian to continue this policy, drawing more and more resources east to protect the vital lands that fed Constantinople and the rest of the empire. However, more often than not, there is something that weighs heavier than pragmatism on the minds of rulers of great states. Even people as smart as Justinian, Theodora, and all their advisors cannot escape the shadow of history that looms over them. When history is taught as a mythical past of larger-than-life events and people living in a romanticized world, the natural feeling is to yearn for a return to this greatness. Unfortunately, time only moves in one direction, and since history is bound by time, it too must always be moving forward. That does not stop rulers throughout the course of history from attempting to turn back the clock, or to regain what their predecessors have lost. Think of Julian the Apostate, who saw the steady march of Christianity as a perversion of the values that had made Rome into the largest and most powerful empire the West had ever seen. Julian believed that through sheer force of will and the power of the imperial crown, he could reverse the religious tide and bring paganism in the empire back into its glory days. He obviously failed in this endeavor, but he was not the only emperor who longed to return to the triumph of the ancestral empire. Theodosius the Great had managed to nominally reunite the Roman Empire, so that Constantinople ruled over a stretch of land that went from the British Isles to Egypt, but that lasted less than a year before it was once again split. Growing up in Constantinople and receiving a rigorous education, Justinian undoubtedly had heard not only of the greatness of the Roman Empire, but also the numerous attempts to return to this glory. Looking to the ideas of Constantine and Theodosius, Justinian's driving philosophy was the idea of Christendom. This ideology would be one of, if not the most important motivations of rulers in the Middle Ages and the early modern period. Christendom was the idea that all Christians of the world were the children of God, and God had intended for them to live together in brotherhood. The way it was interpreted by the Byzantine emperors and later European rulers was that they should conquer all the Christian lands so that there was one Christian nation, ruled by one Christian city and one Christian emperor. Of course, this idea was hardly more than a fool's fantasy. Ignoring all the other issues that blocked the way for united Christendom, the most insurmountable obstacle was that the followers of Jesus Christ had become split over so many different interpretations of their Messiah's word that they could never live together in harmony. Already in this series we have discussed numerous ecumenical councils that sought to rectify these differences among Christians, and we have discussed how each one failed. Going into the future, the cracks and divides within so-called Christendom will only widen and spread. That did not stop Justinian from dreaming of being the man to unite all of God's kingdom under the rule of Constantinople. There was just one problem with Justinian's plan. Well, there were a lot of problems, obviously, but the one we are going to focus on is that Justinian could not split his attention between the East and West. The resources required to reconquer the past Roman Empire and unite the Western and Eastern Christians were mutually exclusive with the resources required to completely secure the Eastern provinces against the Sassanids and other threats. So Justinian had to choose between fighting the Persians and protecting the economic and cultural heart of his empire, or conducting an expedition to the west. As we saw at the end of last episode, when Justinian withdrew his most talented and trusted general from the Sassanid War, he followed his dreams rather than his logic. Justinian's shift in focus from east to west would not have immediate catastrophic results, so we will continue the discussion of the major events of his reign before we go into the results of such a shift. To orient ourselves, the year is 532, the fifth of Justinian's reign, and our gaze is fixed back to the titular city of Constantinople. During the first 5 years of his reign, Justinian had already proved to be an energetic and effective ruler, with his codification of the law and general decent management of the everyday tasks of ruling. He was not, however, a very popular ruler. The good PR he had gotten during the reign of his uncle, when he reopened the circuses and turned back the frugal and moralistic policies of Anastasius, had dissipated, and the population of Constantinople had turned on him. Their chief concerns were not necessarily against Justinian personally, but rather his choice of advisors and administrators. There were many such villains that the quote-unquote people did not approve of, but I will just mention the two that we have already gone over. The first was Tribonian, who despite his unrivaled genius in the legal world, had a bad reputation due to his rampant abuse of his position to receive bribes from those with legal troubles. The other was Belisarius, who had distinguished himself as a capable general at the Battle of Dara, which stopped the war with the Persians from spinning completely out of control. But defeats he suffered both early in his career and after the Battle of Dara brought up charges of cowardice and treason. Belisarius was acquitted, but when he answered the summons of Justinian and returned to Constantinople, there was a sizable portion of the population who did not cheer his arrival. These two were not the only ones in the administration that the people had soured on. In 532, Constantinople was a powder keg of discontent that was just waiting for something to spark it. So before Justinian could march west to face his destiny, he had to make sure that the capital wouldn't tear itself apart, or more importantly, tear him apart. Like all parts of history, the problem that Justinian faced at home was multifaceted and, like defusing a bomb, if the wires weren't cut in a specific order, the whole thing could blow up in his face. The citizens of Constantinople were obviously the most prominent and eye-catching part of the problem, and they had sincere grievances with the emperor that had lit a fire in their hearts. But this fire was not strong enough to lead to any drastic action, at least not alone. The anger of the crowd had to be stoked by others, who had something political to gain from seeing Justinian fall, or simply held a grudge against him. The aristocrats and political leaders who opposed Justinian turned to the most powerful political body outside the emperor's control, the circus factions. As we have previously discussed, these factions were immensely influential among the common people, and leveraged this power to affect the way the imperial government ran. To side against one faction in favor of the other was sometimes unavoidable, and often led to violent demonstrations in the streets of Constantinople. Justinian hoped that by limiting the power of both factions, he could snuff out the threat of the factions altogether without provoking one against the other. All he really managed to do was unite the blues and the greens against him, and the fire began rising around him. Toward the tail end of the year 531, the situation in Constantinople was really heating up. The new taxation policy instituted by Justinian's advisor John the Cappadocian had targeted the richest of Byzantine society and turned that group against the emperor. Likewise, the attempts at reforming the civil service to reduce government expenditure had alienated the senatorial class. The war with the Persians had turned into a quagmire, and it became more and more obvious that it would have to end with the Byzantines giving concessions. This made the military and the common people feel betrayed, and they blamed the emperor for the failure to defeat their enemies. All these aggrieved groups joined together under the umbrella of the discontented circus factions, and began to plot a way to get rid of their common problem. The pieces were in place, the city sat on a knife's edge. All it would take was one little push. The chain reaction that would cause the emotional explosion in Constantinople began with a rather unremarkable chariot race at the end of 531. As was common for such sporting events, one team won, the other team's fans were pissed, and limited rioting broke out. During these riots, leading members of both factions were allegedly involved in a series of murders and were arrested. This might seem like an extreme scenario to modern listeners, but it was not uncommon for there to be rioting after a sporting event, and for these riots to lead to at least a few deaths. Justinian treated this case just like any other, and the law was clear. In the event of conviction for charges of murder, the sentence was execution. It is unclear by what method the executions were carried out, but it must not have been a very reliable one, because two of the convicted men managed to survive and escape to a nearby church. Each of these two men represented a different faction, and their common plight helped with the unification of the two parties. The church was quickly surrounded by an agitated mob who called for justice. In their opinion, justice was not for the murderers to be executed, but instead be let go, as the people believed that they had been unfairly convicted by the emperor, who was a well-known opponent of the circus factions. Justinian was in a bind. In front of him he had two choices: either send in the city guards to violently disperse the crowd and break into the church to capture the fugitives, or capitulate to the crowd's demands. Justinian was clever enough to realize that any violence against the mob would be answered with rioting that he could not hope to control with his limited number of loyal soldiers within Constantinople. So he took the other option and declared that the two fugitives would have their sentence changed to life in prison, and that he would host lavish games in the first month of 532 to commemorate his mercy. Not having the men executed was probably the right decision for Justinian to make, but the addition of an extravagant series of games that were sure to draw huge crowds of blue and green supporters was not the brightest idea the emperor ever had. His half measure of simply throwing the men into prison rather than executing them also did very little to quell the anger of the general population. This was the match that lit the fuse, and now all Justinian could do was hunker down as Constantinople inevitably exploded. On the 13th of January, a massive crowd assembled at the Hippodrome. Even from far away, in his box on the palace grounds, Justinian could see and hear that the audience was agitated. Still, he believed that they would forget their hatred of him once the games commenced, and so he gave the go-ahead to start the show. Now, I've done my fair share of praising Justinian for his intelligence and political genius, but anyone of his level of education should have known at this point that sporting events did not calm crowds down. They rile them up. These events often lasted all day, and some even went for multiple consecutive days. The longer the games went, the more energy the crowd gained, until by the end of the first day, the people had ceased cheering for their teams and begun chanting in unison, Nika, Nika, Nika. The word Nika loosely translates to some version of win, victory, or conquer. It is unclear why they chose this specific word to chant, but it is obvious that they wanted Justinian's attention. They wanted him to listen to them, to free the two convicted murderers, and to dismiss his corrupt advisors. To Justinian, this seemed to be just another day at the office. It was common for the people at the games to shout at the imperial box in an attempt to get the emperor to capitulate to their demands. But this time was different. This time, the crowd wasn't divided by green or blue loyalty. They were united under very specific demands and far more energetic than normal. Soon, the energy of the crowd reached a fever pitch, and they broke out of the confines of the Hippodrome and spilled into the streets. Their first target was the palace of the city prefect, which was used as a sort of jailhouse. Here, they released not just the two blue and green leaders, but all the men that were held prisoner there, and then they burned it to the ground. From there, they made their way to two of the most important political buildings in Constantinople, the Praetorian Prefecture, essentially the governor's house, and the Senate house. At this point, the mob still had cohesion and direction, but they were also a force of pure destruction that did not pause to think about the sacred tradition of these institutions. They simply put them to flame and moved on. From there, they moved through the city, leaving a trail of destruction on their way towards two more immensely important buildings. Unlike the Praetorian Prefecture and the Senate House, that represented the government, these next two buildings were more of cultural and spiritual significance. We can easily understand why the crowd would want to destroy buildings that were symbolic of the institutions that they were rioting against, but the destruction of the great churches of Hagia Irene and Hagia Sophia can only be rationalized as the consequence of a movement that had slipped out of control. The rioters were not heathens or barbarians. Almost all of them were likely either Orthodox or some other form of Christian, and so the churches must have been cherished houses of worship in their eyes. But by now, the mob had been driven into a frenzy by the violence, and were completely blinded by their bloodlust. And so the crowning jewels of Constantinople, arguably more important than the imperial palace, went up in flames, along with countless other buildings. So far, we have only discussed the material damage that the rioting caused, but much more horrendous is the massive human toll it took. While the people that had been whipped into this fury by their anger at a few specific individuals, namely John the Cappadocian, Tribonian, the city prefect Eudaemon, and the emperor, that did not stop the rampant collateral damage that is the defining characteristic of mass riots. Whether they were accused of being imperial sympathizers and murdered, killed by city guards, caught in the fires that now spread throughout the entire city, or were simply trampled by the rampaging masses, there was an unimaginable number of innocents who died as a result of the Nika riots. By the time everything calmed down 5 days after the instigating event, the number of dead was estimated to be around 30,000. Exact population numbers from this time can be hard to pinpoint due to imperfect census taking, but it is estimated the entire population of Constantinople was around 500,000. To put that in perspective, the deadliest single-city riot in American history was the draft riot in Manhattan in 1863. During these 3 days of the draft riot, around 120 people died out of a total population of over 1 million. If we compare the two by percentage of total population killed, the Nika riots were about 500 times more deadly than the deadliest riot in American history. Turning away from the truly horrifying and mind-boggling number of people killed during the riot, we will now go over Justinian and the imperial court's perspective of the events. When it all kicked off on the 13th of January, Justinian was caught completely by surprise. Sure, he had known that the citizens of Constantinople were unhappy with him and his administration, but he did not expect even for a moment that they would turn to such violence. At first, he wanted to stick to his playbook and offered to host even more games in order to placate the crowd, but after the mob surrounded the palace and began knocking on his door, he finally accepted that he would need to actually concede to some of their demands. On the second day of the riot, the political leaders of the mob and a large number of their followers returned to the Hippodrome to discuss terms. It must have been a bit of a comical scene, despite the seriousness of the situation, as the mob was forced to make their demands by shouting up to the emperor in his box. Despite the fact that Justinian was physically towering over them, it was obvious to all parties that he had very little leverage with which to negotiate with. He was completely powerless to stop the violence. The leaders of the rioters demanded that Tribonian, John the Cappadocian, and Eudaemon be relieved from their posts in the imperial government immediately. Seeing no wiggle room on this matter, Justinian immediately complied. It seems like the senators that were on the side of the mob had expected Justinian to push back at least a little on this issue, and were now surprised to learn that the emperor had no hope of doing anything other than exactly what they told him to. With this new development, instead of attempting to subdue the crowd, they pushed them to go even further. The goal now wasn't to simply reform the imperial court, but to remake it entirely by replacing Justinian with a more pliable candidate. The man the senators finally agreed should be emperor was one of the 3 nephews of Anastasius. If you recall, there was a fanciful tale about how Anastasius at first wanted God to decide which of his nephews should succeed him by having the right one sit on a designated couch. Apparently God had heard the prayers of the nephews louder than those of Anastasius, because none of them wanted to be emperor, and so none of them sat on the special couch. By all accounts, the nephews were happy to remain a part of Constantinople's upper class without the headache of ruling, and so they did not protest when Justin and then Justinian took the throne. But now the senators were in need of a figurehead, and unlucky Hypatius, nephew of Anastasius, was the one they chose. Poor Hypatius had never had ambition for the imperial diadem, and so when the Nika riots broke out, he and his brother sheltered with some senators inside the imperial palace. They wanted to stay close to Justinian, so he did not think that they were on the mob's side. But Justinian was already suspicious of the Senate's intentions, so he had all the senators and those that were hiding with them expelled from the palace grounds. Now Hypatius barricaded himself in his home, hoping that the violent gangs that now roamed Constantinople would not murder him or burn his house down. But another fate awaited the elderly noble, one that he could have hardly expected. On the 5th day of rioting, after Justinian had folded to the senators and the factional leaders, Hypatius was dragged from his home and hoisted up by the crowd in the hippodrome. One member of the mob placed a golden necklace around his head, and they proclaimed him emperor. Hypatius did not want to be emperor, and he certainly did not want to usurp Justinian. But when a bloodthirsty and barely controlled mob tells you that you are their new leader, your best option is to just go with it. That is how Hypatius became a reluctant participant in the Nika riots, and how his fate was sealed against his wishes. Meanwhile, inside the palace, Justinian had gone from worried to outright panicked, since the rioters' elevation of Hypatius meant only one thing for him: death. Justinian was a dreamer, and he had grand plans for his future and his legacy that did not include him being the first Byzantine emperor to die by being torn to pieces by his own subjects. He believed his only option was to escape Constantinople now and come back with an army. He ordered the court to make preparations for their departure, but Theodora intervened. She knew that what an emperor needed in order to rule, more than gold and more than armies, was for his people to respect and fear him. They would never follow a leader that had run like a coward in the face of danger. In an impassioned speech, Theodora declared to Justinian that, quote, "Who is born into the light of day must sooner or later die, and that purple is the noblest winding sheet," meaning that she would rather be buried wearing her purple imperial robes than live as a fugitive. The wisdom and passion of Theodora steadied Justinian's nerves, and he called off his departure. Resolved to stay and see an end to the upheaval in his capital city, Justinian and his advisors began plotting a final confrontation that would bring order back to Constantinople. The plan that they finally settled on was broken up into 2 stages. The first stage was a bit of underhanded diplomacy. Justinian sent a man named Narses, who was a well-liked imperial bodyguard, with a hefty bag of gold into the hippodrome. All the leaders of the riot were still in the arena with Hypatius, but old rivalries seemed to be playing a factor as the green leaders and the blue leaders congregated in separate areas. Narses made his way over to the blues and gave them the money, saying, "The emperor offers this gift in hopes that you will remember that he was once your patron and could see himself becoming one again." Narses also reminded the blues that they hated the greens and that Hypatius was a green. If they continued to go down this path, they would be replacing an emperor who was sympathetic to their cause with one who was not. The words and the gold did the trick, and as the day dragged on, more and more blues began trickling out of the hippodrome. Now that the mob's numbers had been thinned, it was time for a second stage of the plan to go into effect. If Narses was the carrot, then Belisarius and his colleague Mundus were the stick. The 2 generals led their troops to attack from 2 directions, while also barricading all the exits of the hippodrome. What ensued can only be described as a massacre. The 2 groups of soldiers indiscriminately killed any rioter, whether they were green or one of the blues that had stuck around. When the slaughter was complete, Belisarius arrested the senators and Hypatius. It was the bloodbath at the hippodrome that contributed most to the 30,000 dead as a result of the rioting, but it did achieve the goal of ending the violence in Constantinople. As the sun rose on the 19th of January 532, Justinian looked out from his perch in the imperial palace and saw his capital quiet, but in ruins. No invading army or earthquake or flood had ever wreaked as much destruction on the city as what it had just endured from its own people. Countless buildings and sculptures that had made Constantinople the envy of the world were now just rubble and ash. Principal among these losses was the great churches of Hagia Sophia and Hagia Irene. More than any government building, column, bridge, or sculpture, these churches had been the heart and soul of the city for almost 200 years. Now they were gone, and though many buildings still remained and over 500,000 people still dwelt there, Constantinople felt empty. But Justinian and Theodora's court were not ones to give in to despair. In an attempt to find the silver lining to the whole depressing affair, they viewed the destruction of the riots as a cleansing fire that now allowed the city to rise from the ashes, stronger and more beautiful than ever before. The discussion on the restoration of the capital will have to wait for the next episode. For now, there are lessons to be learned and debts to be repaid. On the point of lessons, both Justinian and his people had learned something from this whole ordeal. For Justinian, he had learned that though the emperor had so much power that he was closer to God than to man, this did not mean that he was infallible, or that he could not be replaced should he go too far. Justinian now knew that the people were not just powerless sheep to be herded around and commanded. They were like dogs that had been trained to listen to their master, but if pushed too far would easily revert back to their natural state as pack predators. Justinian also knew he did not have the manpower to keep the city in line by force. This was also not his style. Justinian was a stern patriarch, but he was often hesitant to resort to violence if an alternative path was open. He much preferred a nuanced, soft power approach to ruling. Time and time again, it will be Theodora who has to step up and convince her husband that there is no other option, and hard, overwhelming force is needed to assert his will over the people. Such was the case when it came to dealing with the leaders of the Nika conspiracy. There was no question that the senators and circus leaders were guilty. Those that had not already died in the hippodrome were swiftly executed. Where Justinian's hand wavered was when it came to sentencing Hypatius. The emperor knew that Hypatius was an unwilling accomplice in the plot to overthrow him, and Justinian had grown up in the court of Anastasius, so he had likely known Hypatius for most of his life. But Theodora was not sentimental towards Hypatius. She reminded Justinian that the people had chosen Hypatius over him, and if he lived, there was no certainty that they wouldn't do it again. Despite his personal feelings, Justinian saw the truth in Theodora's cold logic, and so Hypatius and his brother were both sentenced to death. On the other side of the Nika ordeal were the people of Constantinople, both those that had participated in the riots and those that had stayed home but stood witness to its chaotic destruction. These people, subjects of the emperor, had felt that their voices were being heard by their sovereign when they spoke through the circus factions. As the power of the factions grew, the feeling among the people was that the emperor was no longer some untouchable deity that they must listen to with complete obedience, but rather just a man. The Nika riots had been a culmination of this growing sense of entitlement, and the frustration at Justinian's inaction on their demands. When the uprising was inevitably crushed, and the emperor escaped from the whole thing relatively unscathed, the opinion of the masses once again swayed in the other direction. The riots had proved to them that no matter how much of a commotion they made, the emperor was powerful enough to simply brush them aside and do what he pleased. The realization of the common man's insignificance led to the remainder of Justinian's reign being relatively unchallenged. But as time went on, the people began to forget what they had learned from Nika, and began to feel that they deserved to be listened to again. In the last few years of Justinian's life, he would once again face off against the people of Constantinople, as history proves that wherever there is tyranny, there will be opposition to it. For now, we will close the chapter on the Nika riots, and look to the future restoration of Constantinople in our next episode. As always, if you have any questions or think I missed anything, please feel free to email me at hofcpod.cast@gmail.com or DM me on Twitter at HOFC_podcast. Thank you for listening to this episode, and please join me next time for the history of Constantinople.